I want to thank all of our guests that are here today. We appreciate that you've taken the time out of your day to sit down here and go over Chapter 558 and construction defects with Ben, Paul, and myself. We're looking forward to providing you as much information as possible for this 1-hour webinar. These things that make relentless effort in making sure that candidates are registered and putting this all together. I also wanted to thank Megan from Epic and also Ashley from here at Affinity Management Services. So thank you, ladies, for helping put this together. Without you, none of this would be happening. Let me go ahead and start off by introducing today's panel of experts. I'm going to start off with Ben Messerschmidt. Ben's work experience ranges from forensic and engineering assessment of mid and high-rise luxury condominiums, master plan residential communities, residential buildings, parking structures, structure failures, and building code compliance deficiencies. Epic Forensic Engineering is a full-service, multidisciplinary engineering consulting firm, keeping very true to its name. So today I wanted to welcome Ben, and thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
Pleasure. Next, I wanted to introduce Paul Terry, co-founder and managing partner of Angus & Terry, construction defects attorney. Since 1984, Mr. Terry has focused his practice on assisting condominium and homeowners associations, apartment owner, and other property owners resolve their construction defects. Mr. Terry has also had the ability of securing a $19.3 million recovery from a 30-story high-rise condominium association. So with further ado, I wanted to introduce Mr. Paul Terry.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here with us. For myself, my name is Rafael Aquino. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Affinity Management Services. We are an association management company. Our core focus is within the Tri-County area, Palm Beach, Dade, and Broward County. We are not your large size organization, but more of your middle size organization. So our ideal clients are clients that are looking to work for a company that's really going to provide that high touch and that high support. So let's get to what I'm sure our participants are here to talk about. So either Ben or Paul, feel free to jump in. I wanted to ask the question with regards to the transition, right? Before we get into the Chapter 558, there's a lot that goes on in transitioning the property. And maybe this question is a little bit more catered towards you, Paul. Could you give our audience a little bit of an understanding of the transition process and how that works itself out?
Sure. The transition process obviously is the process by which the control of the association goes from the developer to the homeowners. It is a little bit different in condominiums than it is in homeowner associations. Although they do have certain similarities. The big issue is that when you hit 90% of the units being sold, it starts a timeline. And depending upon whether you're in a condominium or a homeowners association, certain things need to take place before you actually vote on the who are going to be the representatives on the homeowner board of directors. There's also a list of documents that need to be delivered from the developer to the new board. One of those documents is an audited financial statement, which is obviously very important because then you know what money was brought in and what was done with it. And then if you're in a condominium project, you're also entitled to receive what's called an engineering turnover report, which is a report prepared by a company such as Ben's that does a somewhat cursory, but a visual inspection of all the major components, and then provides information about their remaining useful life and their cost of replacement. And that's an excellent starting place for most associations trying to determine whether or not they have any issues.
And actually picking up on that, if you don't mind, Rafael, so Paul mentioned that very important thing that there is an engineering turnover report at the time of transition. That's certainly not to be confused with what we're going to be diving into as far as anything pertaining to the Florida Statute 558 process. And that's going to be, even just from a size standpoint of things, to Paul's credit, it is saying that the initial report is really just a turnover, a very cursory small report. It lets you know what components you have on the property, what their expected useful life is, and it's really consists of about 3 tables. And that's basically it. It doesn't dive into the true detail as to, do you have any construction defects with any of these components? Are they installed wrong? Is there design issues that will be affecting the performance of these items? That really comes after turnover, when you do your due diligence, both with your engineer, with a firm like us, and also any forensic accountants as well.
Excellent point, Ben. And I wanted to add to that, because at least from the management perspective, like as you stated, it's 2 different reports, right? But that initial report, for those board members that are on the call today, that are on these newer properties, it's very important that you obtain that report, because it does help you, especially your management team, on what needs to be serviced on a day-to-day. Depending on the report that's provided, we've seen some very good reports where it gives you serial numbers and information on the equipment that's there. So it allows management to be able to manage those assets properly moving forward. So entering that information into the management software, so that as a board, or I should say as a manager, they're tagging the work orders that are created for that piece of equipment, so that you can have some analytics moving forward. So if you don't get that, make sure that you do get that.
Yeah, and let me throw one other thing in here, Rafael. Sure. Ben is correct that the turnover report is cursory and certainly not something that you want to rely upon as a definitive evaluation of your building. But one thing that it does do is that it oftentimes identifies defective conditions, although it doesn't use that label. And once those defective conditions are identified, the statute of limitations clock is now running. So while the report is not thorough, anything that it does happen to identify, the association's on notice of that, and the 4-year statute of limitations is running.
Excellent. And with regards to, what's your experience, Paul, from developers turning over? Obviously, I have my experience, but what's your experience from developers turning over what they need to turn over that's important for the Chapter 558 or the construction defect claim?
Well, there's several things, particularly with respect to condominiums. They're required to produce a set of the plans and specifications used to build the project. Those plans have to be certified either by the developer itself or by an architect or an engineer. And so holding on to those plans is a very good idea. Also having that certification, particularly if the developer does it or a representative of the developer does it, because then you can hold them to those plans. You don't get a set of plans like in a homeowners association. It just happens in a condominium. So that's very important. You're also required to receive a list of who all the vendors were who were involved in constructing the project. That's another key piece of information to have. Mm-hmm. When you go about evaluating what's wrong with the building. And then sometimes if it's just minor things that need to be taken care of, if you're not getting cooperation from the developer, sometimes you can reach out directly to the subcontractors and get some of those kinds of things taken care of.
Okay, excellent. Is there anything in particular for you, Ben, that makes your life easier that you do obtain, or are there any documents that you find that that you're not getting when you're going through these claims?
Yes. So although it is a statutory requirement for the developer party to turn over a boatload of information, in short, it really becomes more of a wish list, to be quite honest. Right. The biggest and most important thing from an engineering standpoint of things is going to be the plans, like Paul said. Really, the record set, so the stamped record set, and you can, even if you don't get those and you're a property manager, those should be within the county or the city, depending on where you're actually located. So that could be a straight records request if you don't have those. Also, the O&M, so the operation and maintenance manuals for all your major components. That's huge from a maintenance standpoint of things, just to know what you have, what warranties still exist, things like that. I know one wish list item that we love to see, it's not a requirement to turn over, but if the association does still have a very good relationship with the developer parties, and you're in a condominium specifically, we always like to go ahead and request specific shop drawings. Now, we're talking about the post-tensioning shop drawings, as well as the glazing shop drawings. So glazing being your sliding glass doors, windows, and railings. Now, those are very specific for the project. So it's a separate set of sign and seal documents. that gives you the very detailed, it goes above and beyond your standard architectural, structural, mechanical sort of plans, and gives you almost like the schematic, if you were to think about from an electrical diagram, as to how this is constructed.
Okay, excellent, excellent. I know from my experience as well, Ben, I mean, unfortunately, most of the information is not provided the way it needs to be provided. Also, a lot of times there's interest, right? You have the relationship between certain developers with certain management companies, and, you know, while that should never play into it, the reality is that unfortunately sometimes it does. Paul, could you tell us a little bit of what your recommendation is, like in the transition process? Do you recommend associations creating like a transition committee in order to transition these properties properly?
The answer is definitely. It's not something that's called for in the statute, but we strongly recommend that the homeowners and if they don't, even the manager, get together a transition committee. The transition committee doesn't have any power, but they do have the opportunity to begin to discuss among themselves who's interested in actually being on the board, who has qualifications that might be able to assist the association as it goes through its early stages of formation. For example, if there's somebody who's a CPA, that would be a great person to have act as a treasurer of the association. Somebody with management experience and the time to act as a president. And although this sounds a little bit unfair, it's also a time to determine if there's somebody who really shouldn't be on the board of directors, and take informal steps to try and make sure that doesn't happen, because that can really mess up an association to get somebody with a private agenda that they're going to try and push, and it really distracts from getting an association off on the right foot.
Correct. Yeah. I mean, the beginning is one of the most, you know, it's the foundation of everything to move forward. And you do see it at times where, you know, the developer has one or two people, even though they've turned over completely, but they may own some units and they still have some seats on the board. And you need to understand that as a board of directors of what those issues that can happen because that individual is sitting on the board, and certain challenges that you may have. So with regards to next step, right? Board gets turned over. There's a new board now. The association has been completely turned over. How quickly should the board of directors move into hiring a legal counsel and then hiring the engineer? And what's your recommendation of who should come first, Paul?
Well, the first thing to think about is your management company. And what you're trying to decide, even while we talk about these transition committees, is this a manager or management company that you want to keep? Are you comfortable that they are looking out for your interests? Like, I know with Affinity they do that, but there are other management companies whose relationship is so strongly intertwined with the developer that they really don't have the ability to act in the best interest of the association. So that's really one of the first steps to deal with. We offer transition services at a pretty low price, and so I think having some assistance in that transition process is helpful, because what we do is, frankly, we just harass the builder, and they get tired of dealing with us, and it's easier just to give us what they're legally required to give us.
Of course.
But that's something that the manager has a hard time doing. So that's one real advantage of having a transition attorney involved. And then depending upon what's going on, you may be starting to look at construction issues almost immediately. There's a real difference between the kinds of attorneys who do the collections work and deal with the homeowners, and attorneys who deal with the developers. You probably already have an attorney that's handling with the collections as you go through the transition process, particularly if it's been quite a while since the developer began making sales. So I would say probably the first thing you're looking for is an attorney to handle the transition process, and then help the board evaluate whether or not they want to bring on somebody like Ben to do a thorough inspection of the property and determine whether and to what extent a 558 claim is appropriate.
Okay, excellent. And so let's say, Ben, they've hired the attorney, they're ready to rock and roll. They decide, okay, we do need an engineer to assess the building. Could you give our audience a little bit of an understanding of what this report encompasses and the kind of work that you and your firm do?
Sure, yeah, absolutely. So after everything's transitioned and everything is good to go and you have an engineer very similar to myself hired on board, well, first thing we'll go ahead and do is we'll review those plans at a minimum, those being required. That's, again, the basis of our evaluation. So we get an understanding for the property, and then we'll come out and do several on-site inspections. All these are going to be a visual only inspection unless there's something known on the front end that we need to dive deeper. And then the report will be formulated. Typically from our end specifically, we like to take a macro view and then go very micro. So to really get the full building, if we're just focusing on building, for example. Yeah. So we'll start on the outside to our exterior work and then dive into the units and get more up close and personal, so to speak. The report is really going to talk about, there's a loose term, I'll use it, just a construction defect. And what that may be, it could be a workmanship-based issue, it could be a deviation, it could be a straight code violation, it just doesn't meet the code. And a deviation would be like, this wall behind me was supposed to be orange, but for some reason it's green. So it can be something as innocent as that, or it could be you were supposed to have a stainless steel cooling tower, but you have one that's made out of balsa wood. So I mean, they're not going to work the same.
Yes.
So that has a bigger impact than just a true deviation. That value engineering item is going to seriously impact the operations of your property. And then we also focus on one unique item, which is going to be an improper developer turnover maintenance, which is going to be the expectation of something being turned over in good and functioning and maintained order. So the best way to think about it is if you were to go ahead and buy a used car and you expect to have 4 inflated tires and a steering wheel. You show up and you have 3 inflated tires. There's a certain level of expectation, and quite frankly, during the developer's ownership, they need to be maintaining the property, just like during the 558 process. The association needs to maintain the property.
Correct.
So our report will include all that information. We like to put in a very clear and concise format. We put in a matrix, and we have subsequent photos that go for each and every one. And for each item, was what we refer to them as, we'll have a location, an observation, defect, deviation, code violation, or improper developer turnover maintenance, what discipline it boils down to, which is very important, and then the governing criteria. So you have everything that you need in that one area, and then we also, on top of that, give you several representative photos, and we write it in a manner to reach a wide audience, because we know that this is going to be utilized throughout the course of the process. You may have a very technical person, very technically savvy person, an engineer or a doctor or someone like that, or you have a very lay person. Our intent is to have, quite frankly, like a non-technical person at least get to the issue.
Okay.
They may not know what they see, but you know what? They're there and everything lines up, and with a little bit of guidance, they can understand it.
Of course. So Ben, I want to kind of leave it with you here with regards to the selection process of selecting the proper engineer, right? I know the work that you guys do, we're working together on a project with Paul and yourself, and you guys are doing a great job. But for those board members that are new to this, what do you recommend to them when they're going through their selection process of filtering through engineers, the different engineers that exist?
I think the biggest thing, I mean, given the fact that 558 has now been around for some time, or the Florida statute has been around for some time, is knowing and asking these potential engineers, how many cases have they, quite frankly, seen through the end? Have they settled? I mean, there's plenty of people that have started the process, yeah, but whether or not they're still have followed it through the end, and the association has the confidence to still stay with them, I think is going to be very telling. Okay. That would be the one very big question. Also knowing the size of their staff and the experience of the staff. Absolutely go ahead and request the CVs for the individuals that'll be working on that project. Because those may be the people that are going to be on the stand on your behalf. So you want to make sure that even just from a credential standpoint of things, it meets the initial smell test.
Excellent point.
And let me just add here that that forensics, at least in my view, are a subspecialty of engineering.
Absolutely.
And there are many very bright, very qualified engineers that don't have the experience and have no business handling a 558 claim because there's unwritten rules to how the whole process works. And if you don't, as Ben said, if you don't know how it ends up, you can do or say things in the beginning of the process where you don't really understand how they're going to impact your claim at the very end when you're trying to resolve it. So finding somebody who has substantial experience with the forensic, and not only forensic, but litigation forensic side is critical to protect your claim.
Absolutely. And to even piggyback real quick is yeah, I mean, we all went through the same engineering school, right? A crack is a crack is a crack. We can tell you exactly how it happened. Yeah. But it's how it's conveyed and knowing the key terms that you need to use in order to maximize any potential return, and knowing, more importantly, what not to say is really going to make or break your case. I mean, like one key word that I know doesn't show up in any of our reports, primarily for the coverage reasons, 4-letter word, starts with M, ends in old. So that is not a covered item.
Yeah,
so that is not highlighted anywhere.
Of course.
But however, if you have a design engineer going into a unit and finds mold, I mean, it's a common thing, and they may say, okay, well, this is a very relatable thing because a lot of homeowners understand the concept and they put it in a report.
Correct.
They mean well, but it doesn't help.
Yeah, and if I can add to that, it's also just as important to understand that, you know, that the partnership exists between the engineer and the attorney as well, because I know, as I stated earlier, we're working together on a particular case, and I know my manager has spoken highly of how well and how fluid the information moves between two firms. So that's also a very important part when you're going through your selection process. Paul, I have a question here from Guillermo. He's asking, is the process the same for condos and HOAs for construction defects?
The answer is no, although they are somewhat similar. In the condominium context, everything is spelled out in the statutes. It's very specific about when the election has to take place, how the election has to take place, and when documents need to be turned over. In a homeowners association, they defer to what's in the bylaws. As a practical matter, a lot of the stuff in the bylaws does follow the condominium statute guidelines, but that's really the big difference, is that you look to the statute in condominiums, and in homeowner associations, you look to the bylaws.
Excellent. So we kind of keep using the word Chapter 558 very, you know, easily and as if everyone understands. So Paul, why don't you kind of tell our listeners what the Chapter 558 does mean?
Sure. Okay. So Chapter 558 is the chapter of the Florida statutes that contains the construction defect statute. So people use the construction defect statute interchangeably with the 558 process. But they're really part and parcel of the same thing. And what they do is they require that you present a notice of claim prior to proceeding with any kind of litigation. And that claim has to lay out where the developer has an opportunity to come out and inspect those conditions, invite the subcontractors out to inspect those conditions, which is why Ben keeps referring to making sure that the correct trades or parties are identified so the developer knows who to put on notice. And then they have up to 75 days to present some kind of a settlement or resolution to the association.
Okay.
If they don't do it within 75 days, or the association doesn't like whatever they propose, then the association is free to pursue with litigation.
Okay. And if I can add something on top of that,
Sure.
Raphael, before you get started up,
Sure.
And Paul, obviously correct me where I'm wrong here. One main thing that we discuss in any meetings, initial meetings with any potential client, is also that 558 is really a way to consolidate the common items into one entity. So with the association. So for a condo, for example, if you have a governing issue that may be within the units, but it is found to be throughout, that may act as a common element, but it really consolidates all those individual claims into one essential claim. So if you're in a 300 unit tower, it's not 300 individual claims on the same exact issue that's going to bog down the courts. It's really, okay, take that and just lump it into the association acting as the potential plaintiff here and moving forward with their claim.
Excellent. So I'm going to leave it with you here, Ben, because I have a question from Pablo, and he's asking, I think you'll be able to answer this question with the process that you go through. Pablo asked, how many units have to be affected in order to do the Chapter 558? Are there a specific amount of units? Maybe if you can walk us through what the steps that you take within your report, kind of speak of the surveys and so forth that you and your firm do.
Sure. So there isn't any set number per se. So, I mean, it is going to be dependent on how many units are on property. Typically, as a minimum, we like to look at a minimum of 10% of the units. And that's just primarily personal preference. We definitely get into way more, usually. We'd like to get a full scope if you're in a tower. We like to be able to go ahead and map out the exterior as best as we can. So if I access a certain unit, I get out on the balcony, I look up a couple floors, I like right a couple units, left a couple units, down a couple units. So I'm creating concentric circles on the outside. But now the more important thing for a unit owner claim or unit owner issue potentially is whether or not there is some commonality between whichever units are accessed, that they have the same issue. Are they in the same riser stack, for example? Do they have this? Are they the same size unit? So their AC systems are the same exact, the plumbing system are the same exact, electrical systems are same exact. Do they have the same exposure? Could it be a similar crack pattern that you're observing within the stucco or water intrusion? So those patterns are more important than the number of units, quite frankly, because we need to be able to go ahead and within the 558 report, it is a notice report, just like Paul was saying. So we need to go ahead and at a minimum identify that there is an issue. We don't have to 100% say it is this screw of the 20 screws on the sill of the sliding glass door at that point in time. But if we know it, great. But we don't need to go to that level of detail at that point in time.
Right.
Later
and
down
I think
the road,
that's right. That's the big key, is that the investigation for the 558 claim is identifying what all the different defects are, not so much identifying how frequently they occur or how pervasive they are. You're just trying to put the developer on notice. Later on in the process, there'll be more examination, much more thorough. There are engineering standards for how many units you have to look at. And those kind of standards will come into the picture, but usually later on in the process.
And then also from a widespread standpoint of things is once it's in the report, I mean, you will be having several meetings with your engineer and your attorney, and you guys are all in the same huddle together. Just like Rafael was saying, you're all on the same team, so the working relationship is huge. So in those meetings is where you're gonna discuss those specific issues and what they may mean as far as a claim is concerned, or if there's a practical fix, or you're gonna be talking about different ways to handle a specific scenario. So that'll be very, very wide open during those discussions.
Oops.
Oh, I think he's bouncing in and out.
Well, while he's doing that, there's a question that's up here from Scott Campbell. Does the association insurance provider play any role in your determination, as stated, how important it is to have a qualified attorney review the turnover documents in any future construction contracts? Well, let's see. It's definitely a good idea to have a qualified attorney going over the turnover documents, in particular to make sure you got everything you were supposed to get. And instead of getting a certified copy of the plans, maybe what was delivered was just some extra set they had laying around. So somebody needs to look at that and make sure that it is, in fact, the right set. The insurance provider typically plays very little role in the transition process and in the early days of the association, typically because the developer has already worked through a broker and has already purchased that insurance. But as that insurance comes up for removal, for replacement, then that's the right time to get the insurance broker involved and make sure that all the components that are supposed to be insured are in fact insured.
Excellent. Thank you. I see it seems I got disconnected, but I love the fact that you guys kept it going. Thank you. So I already have an idea. You went through the report with regards to let's say the cost of the claim. Ben prepares this big report. I've seen those reports. They're very extensive, very large in size. Paul, what can an association look at with regards to cost? I know you can't pinpoint, but what steps do you take as a firm to help out the client, and what's like an average cost, or how do you work to deal with?
So the first issue that you're going to face is with these 558 claims is how you want to go about compensating your attorney. There's two broad categories of ways to do that. One is that the association pays the attorney hourly for the time they spend working on the claim. And in those instances, the association pays for the forensic investigation, like from Ben's firm. When you hire your attorney on a contingency fee basis, or what I call a pure contingency fee basis, then the attorney advances all of those expenses, so the association doesn't come out of pocket for them. Depending on the size of the project, that initial forensic report can run anywhere from $25,000 to $75,000, sometimes more, if the project is big enough and has enough components that have serious problems. So you're typically looking, though, I would say 25 to 75,000.
Yeah.
Do you agree, Ben?
Yeah, I mean, depending if the association is smaller, it can be smaller as well. And really also understanding the needs of both the association and the attorney that's already involved, as far as what sort of notice and what the agenda may be, as far as getting the ball rolling.
Right.
So knowing that we have to meet that standard and then move forward.
Yeah, that's one of the things that we typically do is we ask the engineer, in fact, we just asked Ben to do this, to do a real quick down and dirty inspection of the property and hit the big points. And the reason for that is that this 75-day pre-litigation process you have to go through is frequently a complete waste of time. And so the sooner you get the initial notice out and you start that 75-day period running, the sooner you can get your claim resolved. So oftentimes we won't ask him to do the full blown, $50,000, $75,000 report. We'll ask for something much smaller, as Ben said, just to get the ball rolling and get the clock started so we can get to resolution of the claim a lot earlier.
Yeah, and it's important also for the board members that are on, or even managers, that while the number can seem pretty high, right now, you do have to keep in mind that the cost of some of these repairs are much more, especially if you let them linger in the long haul. So it's important that you're really looking out for the future of the building, because it is your fiduciary duty as a board to do so. Also, for the managers that are on the call, it's very important that you're keeping track of the issues that arise as you're managing the property, because it's going to help out Ben or whatever firm you decide to go with to be able to pinpoint what the potential issues may be. Even if it's something as simple as doors not closing properly, you should be noting that, creating work orders, so that when the engineer is hired, you can provide them, listen, these are all the work orders that I had. And then that way the engineer can decide, okay, I'm going to look at these units, I'm going to look at that unit. And it's going to make things a little bit, I didn't say a little bit, it's going to make it much easier for the firms to understand what they're going to put into their report.
Exactly. If I can tag along on that one, Rafael. So, and that's a very, very good point. I'm happy that you made it. Now, having a list of known issues when you have an engineer like myself get on board is going to be huge. Because think about it. And we'll use the car scenario again. If you had to replace a headlight, just the bulb went out. And during the engineering study, we're evaluating the car, we'll say in this example, and I see, oh, the driver's side headlight is out. Okay, you're just replacing the bulb, no problem. That's a snapshot in time. If I knew beforehand that that's the 20th time that bulb needs to be replaced, it's way more than a bulb issue.
Correct.
So using that as a frame of reference, because we step into every single common area room and we're looking around, and if everything looks fine and we don't have any prior knowledge to that, we can't say anything. Now, if we do know that this room is just freshly painted because there's been water pouring in here for this entire wet month in South Florida, then I mean that's a huge to know.
Correct. No, a great point. Excellent point. Great analogy there. Now, I have seen it's very common practice where developers try to get off the hook, and I want to ask this question to you, Paul. Where they'll try to slide in a waiver when they're turning over the documents. What's your recommendation for any waivers that are given either to management or to the board? What steps should they take?
Well, okay, so if you're talking about a waiver early on, my advice is very simple. Don't do it. Waivers or really releases are very common at the end of these claims. And they're appropriate. Somebody's paying, typically millions and millions of dollars. They're entitled to a release. But that release gets agreed to after there's been a thorough inspection of the building. And so you've really identified what all the major problems are, and most of the minor ones. And so that when you release any further claims, you know what you're releasing. If you do that early on before there's been a thorough engineering investigation, then you don't have any idea what you're releasing. And oftentimes, and we see this all the time, the developer, says, well, yeah, we owe you $25,000 because of the forensic accounting. So we're going to give you $25,000 and we want you to sign this release. And the release releases everything that has anything to do with the building. And to do that for $25,000 is completely ridiculous.
Of course.
And so in the context of this 558 process, no board should ever be releasing anything.
Correct.
There's just no way that you know enough about the building and enough about what you're potentially releasing in order to be able to do that consistent with your fiduciary duty.
Of course. And now, Ben, with regard to the work that you're doing, how are you guys dealing with the inspections and with everything that's going on with COVID? What steps are you taking, or do you have any protocols in place to do these inspections in these units in the midst of COVID?
So first and foremost, everybody on our staff is wearing the proper PPE. I mean, even within our office and everywhere, quite frankly. But when we enter units, I mean, we are providing a list prior to the association. And the benefit of us just taking a sample size of the units and not doing every single unit is that if we need to go ahead and shift a unit because a resident does not feel comfortable for whatever reason, it's not a problem. With that being said, I mean, it's a very small group that is going into a unit and probably a maximum size of 3 individuals from our staff. So that's how we're basically doing our interior evaluations, at least within units. But for every other evaluation that we have, we're looking at a roof, doing just the common corridors, your amenities, or the exterior. We're pretty isolated from the entire community. I mean, we're all wearing our Epic logoed clothing, so at least you know that we're a vendor on site and we are not just a resident. Although on some of these properties, I'd love to be a resident, but not yet.
Excellent. So, and I apologize, Paul, ahead of time. I don't know if you answered this question while I was disconnected. With regards to the coverages and the actual lawsuit, if a lawsuit has to be filed, can you guide the board, our listeners through that process and who covers the attorney fees? Does the insurance company for the developer kick in? And if you can kind of go a little bit high level on that process.
Well, sure. Okay. So in these cases, 95% of the money, sometimes more, comes from insurance carriers. And so as Ben was alluding before, it's important to know what kinds of things are typically covered under insurance policies and what kinds of things aren't. So if there's two possible causes of something, you want to make sure that you identify the cause that's covered. And that's really the big issue with the insurance is making sure that when you formulate your claim, that claim is formulated in a way that's intended to trigger the insurance coverage under these policies. Because if you don't, then a lot of the developers, even though they're big names, they have formed what are called single project LLCs, which is that they form a separate company that they manage, but it's a separate company that's actually building any particular project. And so you don't have a claim against whoever the big builder is. You only have a claim against that LLC, which by the time you get around to making a claim may have no assets left in it. And so all you're left with is the insurance policies. And so that's why it's really critical that you pay very close attention, both the engineer and the attorney, to what's in those reports and what gets reported to the insurance carriers and and how that they start reporting early on and creating reserve funds. And so everything is triggered by how those initial reports are framed.
And a good example, oh, sorry, Raphael, a good example of that would be, and what we see a lot on some master developments and condo projects, is that you have a crack on the exterior of the building. Now that crack is not an insured item to go ahead and fix the crack. But if water is entering through that crack and entering into the building and now causing damages to the interior or a subsequent component, that is covered. So it is being able to navigate that from an engineering end and also presenting it in the legal end is really where it ties everything together.
Okay. And just for the record, I'm not conceding the crack isn't covered.
But yes, I totally get it.
I'm going to look for a way to get it covered.
So part of our role in management is managing expectations. And you know, a lot of times some of the damages aren't as excessive and aren't impacting, I guess I should say, residents heavily, but they are going to impact in the long haul. In those cases, could you give our listeners an idea of what we're looking at, time frame for the engineering report? And then Paul, if you can kind of jump in. Obviously, I know when we're doing legal, things can go back and forth, but just to kind of give our listeners on what they're looking at from start to somewhat finish.
Sure. So on a typical project, I would say, at least from the front end, well, let me start off by saying this, and the 558 process is not a fast process, unfortunately. We can put the pedal to the ground as far down as we can, but we can only control so much. Now with smart, I guess, with the smart team on either end, being engineer and attorney, I mean, you can expedite it as much as you can, but having that expectation that it is not going to be settled in 2 months, that really needs to resonate with everyone there. Because what we tend to see is a lot of turnover of a board, and you might have one person on there that just says, we've spent how much in engineering and how much in attorneys and what have we gotten done? Stuff that doesn't even make sense to me. Let's make a deal right now. I want to be out. And I get that from a homeowner sense, but it is not doing the community justice for the issues that they have. So at least with that being said, the front end is where we can control things, which is the good news. So typically we'll operate anywhere between a 90 to 120 day window. We've done reports in as fast as 30 days, maybe even a little bit less, if there's something governing on the legal end that needs to have a hard deadline by the court. So we'll do our report at that point, and it'll get sent on to the appropriate parties, and that's when that clock starts, that 75-day window that Paul was going ahead and talking about. But that front end is really the true part that you get to control. The association gets to control. Thereafter, it's going to have turns and stop signs and some speed bumps. I'm just falling in this car analogy more and more, but that's in short what happens through the process.
So what I can add to that is, as Ben said, typically you want to get some kind of claim started as soon as possible. So we'll typically have the engineer do a very cursory report. You file your 558 claim, your notice, your clock is running, and then you have the engineer go back and do a much more thorough report. But while they're doing that more thorough report, the clock is still running the whole time. The other thing I tell clients is that after you file a lawsuit, you sue the builder, maybe the general contractor, they're going to file claims against all the subcontractors and sometimes against the architect. And they're all going to make claims against each other. And that takes a while. And depending upon who really knows what they're doing and how efficient they are, that can be anywhere from 60 to 90 days before they finish that process. Once they do, then you go back in front of the judge and you get a scheduling order, or what's called a case management order, that actually starts what we would think of as a case moving forward. And we tell clients it's 18 months to 2 years from the date of the first case management conference that you can expect generally to have your claim resolved.
Excellent, thank you. And what kind of, Paul, I'll leave it with you, what kind of damages can be recovered in these construction defect claims?
Well, a couple of things. One is going to be the cost of repair. That's going to be the primary ticket that you're going to recover. You can recover prejudgment interest on whatever the cost of repair turned out to be. You can also recover for your expenses in maintenance that you incurred because there were construction defects, which is another reason why it's so important to maintain records of those maintenance costs, because those are all elements of damages. And then you're going to ultimately be able to recover your expert costs. But the big ticket one, the one that's going to drive everything, is going to be the cost of repair, and that triggers prejudgment interest. So those are the two really big ticket items.
Okay, excellent. And Ben, it looks like you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, thank you. I was going to tag on a little bit. So as far as the expert fees are concerned, so it would be like one thing to consider is for a case that is lasting a little bit longer and some of those fees are going up, it is really looking at an ROI. I mean, your return on investment, quite frankly, is what it becomes.
Yep.
Because once you start, if you are going through the process for some time and your engineer is heavily involved, they are doing a very deep dive into specific issues. And it's not going to be $1,000 issue. These are going to be your 6 figures, 7 figures, hopefully not your 8 figures. I mean, it's going to be large items. So those efforts will be absolutely built into the overall claim, 100%, because I mean, that was, the association shouldn't, in theory, the association shouldn't be responsible for any sort of faulty construction that they unfortunately inherited without even knowing.
Okay, and let's say that there is some damages. For instance, we've seen, you know, leaking pools and so forth. Let's say there's some damages that need to be repaired. What are your recommendations? Should the association take the steps to repair it themselves? What's your recommendation from an engineering perspective of what they need to do if the repair has to be done and they can't wait till the claim gets settled?
In short, repair it. I mean, there's only one additional step that goes in there, and I'm sure Paul's going to go ahead and say it. It's really just placing the opposing parties on notice. You don't want to go ahead and be fixing absolutely everything in the entire report. One thing we would recommend is really, I mean, you need to maintain the lifestyle of the community. You need to also take care of any life safety concerns without a doubt. Those at a minimum need to be handled. A pool, which is a good example, a leaking pool that is going to cause further and further damage, I would strongly recommend that does get fixed. Because that replastering job now, or that one patch at $1,000 or $5,000 is going to be a 6-figure repair if it's left unaddressed, because you have embedded steel in the slab that is going to corrode, and you're going to have to start replacing that steel. Things that you wouldn't even consider if you tackle it on the front end.
Okay.
The one thing I would add to that, though, is that yes, you need to do repairs, but it's rarely the case that you have to do full-blown, complete repairs at the stage of the litigation, and that's important because oftentimes the association doesn't have the money, frankly, to do like an entire pool repair job. So I agree with Ben. You need to do things like patching the plaster, doing whatever you can to limit the amount of damages. They call it mitigating your damages. So that's important. But the other thing to remember about this is that these claims resolve in mediation through negotiation most of the time. And if you do a full-blown permanent repair of a component, that's going to be the most you're going to be able to claim in damages, and you're going to negotiate down from there. So it's very important that to the extent possible, you perform what we call interim repairs that are designed to mitigate your damages while the litigation process is going on. And then once you settle the case and you have the settlement money, then you go back and you do a permanent repair.
Exactly. And to that effect, even from a claim, from an engineering standpoint, things and looking at the cost, even if the association spends that $1,000, but we know that the issues of the pool are globally on the pool, that full amount of that 6-figure amount will be forecasted along with that repair. So don't feel as though that because you are strapped for cash, so to speak, that's going to limit your overall claim. We're still going to be going ahead and correcting the issues that were based upon the original construction, at least presenting those.
Okay, excellent. So let's say something is being settled, Paul, and the developer has agreed, or maybe they're going to pay up. What steps should an association take? Let's say that developer agreed he's going to pay a lump sum payment. it doesn't end there. What steps do you recommend Poly Association or the board
so
do?
that's a good point. A lot of people think that they're going to recover a certain amount for the roofs, or a certain amount for the stucco, or a certain amount for the windows. And while the claims start out with that level of specificity, by the time you get to the actual settlement, you begin talking about a single amount of money. And then ultimately you get a check, and it's not tied to anything. Prior to agreeing to a settlement, you should be meeting with your engineer or a contractor to talk about what kinds of things absolutely have to be repaired, how much that probably is going to cost, and so have a pretty good idea of what it is that you can get repaired when you accept any particular level of settlement. And then what you want to do is there's a variety of different ways that you can approach the reconstruction process. You're going to need a design professional. Oftentimes that's the same company that was involved in the investigation, because they know the building better than anybody. In a condominium, you have to get 3 bids for repairs, and so you can go out to get bids. Although oftentimes if you had one company that's been involved in the investigation, because the engineers can't get their fingernails dirty, so we have to have contractors out there to do all that work. And that construction company oftentimes has a very intimate knowledge of the systems in the building, particularly the ones that are defective. And so they're always a good company to consider, along with your obligation to get bids, but oftentimes looking to that company because they know your building better than anything. And one of the hard things about going out for bid is that if there's something that's not in the bid documents, and there are construction companies that specialize in doing this, they bid exactly what's in those documents, not a penny more. And then they just wait until they get the contract because they were the low bid, and they say, well, you left out this, and this, and the price is really going to be some other number. So those are things that you really have to watch out for in the bidding process. And like I said, I know we look at the requirement for condominiums to get 3 bids, but sometimes that's not the simple step that the statute sort of suggests that it is. It's a much more nuanced process than that.
Correct.
Yeah, I'll definitely echo some of that, what Paul said. Maybe not the getting fingers dirty, but most of everything else. So, so to that effect, for any of our evaluations, for example, so let's say we do a swing stage evaluation, looking at the exterior of the building, we will go ahead and the association will hire a contractor that specializes in that high rise and in restoration, not new construction, but specifically restoration. That's important to know, and that you can definitely defer to your management company to get an improved list of vendors that would fall within that category. Right. But yeah, like utilizing, like you will likely have some sort of repair or something along the way throughout the process, because it is a process. And using that initial vendor, at least just for one bid, is definitely going to be the path of least resistance. Correct. But you want to make sure that you have the qualified people to take you to the fruition. But one thing I do want to make mention of is, even after settlement, when the association does really take the shovel into the ground, one important thing to consider is that the biggest cost in doing the construction is really mobilizing. Yeah. More times than not for a condominium, it's getting there, getting the staff, getting the tools, getting everybody there. So while you're there, it's our recommendation to go ahead and maximize what you're doing. Now, one concept that gets lost in translation with the association, with the group, the community, is that only some of that is going to be a construction defect. You only got money for some of that, not all of it.
Correct.
Like painting your building, for example. Maybe you were due for a building repaint, but you do have some some concrete deficiencies that need to be addressed, and they're already, paid for. So you've received a settlement for that, but you did not get it for, let's say, the paint, for example. So there will be a kick-in that'll have to occur, likely through the association's reserve, to make up that difference, hopefully, if the reserves were actually properly funded prior to turnover, even at the start, which also doesn't happen.
Hopefully is the right word.
Yes.
So I have a question here from Scott Campbell. He's asking, why am I dealing with the contractor in the settlement agreement and not his insurance provider?
Because you're not properly represented. There's no point. There's virtually no point. There are some exceptions, but they're few and far between, where you're going to get anywhere that's close to what the kind of money you need dealing with the contractor. On these larger claims, you just need to get the contractor, and in fact, you need to get the developer out of the way.
Correct.
And you need to get to the insurance company, which then hires an attorney that's experienced in these kinds of claims. They're going to hire their own experts. They're going to know how to do an investigation. And the thing about insurance companies is that they're the only companies in the world that are in business to pay money. They have to settle claims, because if they didn't settle claims, they would just become overwhelmed. And because of that, what they're looking for is, okay, is this a reasonable cost, and is it covered under the policy? And if you hit those two things, then they're going to pay the claim. Whereas if you're talking to a contractor and the money's going to come out of the contractor's pocket, just because it's a reasonable cost and it is the contractor's responsibility, doesn't mean they're going to just, freely pay it. So you just don't want to be talking to the if it's a small little thing, sure. But if it's a major item, there's no point in talking to the contractor. It's a waste of time. And in fact, if you have not got your 558 notice served on the builder, then the statute of limitations is running. And by the time you realize that the contractor really isn't going to take care of the problem, you could be outside the statute of limitations. So there's no value to talking to the contractor about anything that's significant. Get the 558 notice on file, let your 75 days run, get the lawsuit on file, and that triggers the insurance coverage, and then you're starting to move your case towards resolution.
And to that extent, we've actually seen some contractors on past cases that they've really just thrown a little nugget out to the association. So they say, hey, I'll replace that one little light switch over there.
Correct.
Don't worry about it. I'm such a great contractor. Oh, and then a month goes by. Oh yeah, that leaking something or other, I'll take care of that. Don't worry about it. But it is peanuts compared to the overall claim. But they're just giving the association enough, and it doesn't push the actual agenda, the true agenda forward that needs to move forward. And that does have very important timelines, like Paul was saying.
You'd be amazed at how many times that happens. It's
every single time.
And people are just blinded to it. But believe it or not, fellas, we're getting close to the end. And I think that we have this one question that's very important. So I want to make sure it gets answered. Other than new construction, what types of projects will you consider eligible for construction defect litigation, Paul?
Well, there are two kinds of projects that we'll take a look at. One of the most common ones is re-roofing cases. And then the other one are window replacement cases where you have a lot of the same thing being done. And the things that we look for on those kinds of projects are detailed specifications. Because unlike new construction, where there are all these implied warranties that require the work be done up to a certain standard, when you start to deal with these reconstructions like re-roofing or window replacements, the same standards don't necessarily apply. And because the association is the property owner, they can choose to pay less and get a lower quality, and in some cases even substandard installation. So one of the things that we want to look at is we want to make sure that somebody who knew what they were doing was writing the construction specifications, because that really becomes a standard against which you judge the workmanship. So that's the biggest thing. You want to have something that's been done a lot of times, so roofing, windows, sometimes decks, and then you want to see detailed specifications.
And Ben, with you, I'm sure your firm deals with these kinds of cases and providing reports for those kinds of situations, I'm assuming as well. Is that correct?
Absolutely, and more, quite frankly.
Okay.
I mean, generally speaking, from an engineering end, what sort of issues can you go ahead and pursue a 558? Any work that gets done. But usually the main tipping point is cost. If you get a $5,000 shower pan replacement on one location, does it make sense to hire an engineer? Probably not. Just go ahead and fix it. But for those larger ticket items, I mean, and anything that has a large exposure, so like the roofing, for example, that's protecting your building. Windows, that's protecting your building. Railings, that's protecting the people from falling over. Exterior, water coming in. So those large scale things are probably best suited. So a lot of times whenever we're called for any specific issue, it doesn't matter what it is, either by the association or by an attorney, one of the first questions out of my mouth is, okay, well, what was your original contract amount with the contractor? Let's start there. And quite frankly, I like to run the scenario first with the association, let them know what they're in for and what they may be in for. And just be very candid, because quite frankly, I mean, the more information everybody knows, I mean, the better off we're all going to be.
Of course.
We're not looking, I'm not trying to make a lot of money here. I'm trying to do right by everyone in the community. So, I mean, I have a skill set that we can go ahead and truly help, and that's what I want to do. And getting that conversation started is the first step.
Of course, of course. Excellent. So I'll leave it with you, Ben. Do you have any closing words or closing remarks?
Documentation is key as part of this from an association standpoint of things, residents and managers. Even if you haven't turned over yet, take note of what you're constantly fixing. Take photos, keep samples. You'll be surprised how that one PRV or that one fire sprinkler, I mean, just put it in a Ziploc bag, file it someplace, but hold on to it.
Yep.
If that gets destroyed, that can have a bigger ripple effect than what you might think right now. But documentation would be my first thing. And any questions, we're more than happy to help.
Thank you, Ben. Paul?
What I would say is beware of the statute of limitations. Time is not your friend. And as time goes by, it's easy to put things off and put things off. And you're better off bringing in an attorney, bringing in an engineer, and evaluating what you're dealing with. And then you can make a plan for what's in the best interest of the association. But putting your head in the sand because you don't want to deal with it is rarely in the best interest of the association. So that's the big piece of advice that I would give.
Excellent. Thank you, Paul. And I think I have to feed off both of you in saying that, yeah, it's important to not just only document, as you said, as stated, Paul and Ben, but also making sure that you're working with the right partners, as we said throughout the webinar, because it's going to make the life of the board member and the residents much easier. And also you have to keep in mind, as we've said it multiple times, it's your fiduciary duty to make sure that you're upholding those values and the damages that are within that property, making sure that they're being addressed properly. So with that, I want to close off the webinar. I want to thank you, gentlemen. Again, it's always a pleasure sitting alongside, or I should say sitting virtually alongside the two of you. I do want to leave our board members and managers with this final thought, or final quote, I should say. Herbert Spencer said it best: "The great aim of education is not knowledge, but action." I say that quote because you shouldn't keep this information to yourself. Make sure you get back to your communities and you share it with your fellow board members. Both firms, or should I say all three firms, will be posting the video. So if you'd like to get a copy of the video, you can visit our websites, or you can reach out to Diane. I'm sure she'll share it with you all. But again, make sure to share this knowledge with the rest of your board members. And thank you again all for attending. Thank you, Diana, Megan, and Ashley, for making this happen. I hope everyone has a great day and an amazing weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.